Yeah, I love that.
And so we've got like craft chocolate.
Yeah.
We've got to go back up there and talk about because we got to talk about what are the problems with commercial chocolate, because commercial chocolate has a big shadow that I've only recently become aware of. Like, it was really, we ended up like, Stephen's been obviously into chocolate for years, and we went to your chocolate tasting and I was blown away. Like, I just couldn't believe how much I learned about food, about taste, about flavor, and about chocolate's dark secrets, which I never knew of. Like, we've sold Belgian chocolate in the cafe, and my wife is Belgian, and I'm kind of always, there was always these ideas that Belgian chocolate is good, but I'd love to know a little bit more about chocolate's dark shadow and why the importance of supporting craft chocolate, and why it's a better bet for the planet as well as taste-wise. Or flavor-wise.
Yeah, well, so first of all, it's much better for you, because it doesn't have all the junk and other stuff into it, which we'll go into in a minute. So it doesn't have all the preservatives, all the emulsifiers. Whenever you buy a bar of chocolate, the most important thing to do is look at the ingredients. And basically, if you see stuff that you don't have in your kitchen, or that isn't in any Happy Pear product, just leave it. So if you've got like emulsifiers that you've never heard of, be really skeptical.
Now, what is an emulsifier? Because everyone listening might know what the heck's an emulsifier.
So the simple way to think about an emulsifier is, when you mix a salad dressing, it rapidly separates. But if you add a bit of mustard to it, you can sort of like get the oil and the vinegar to stick together. That's an emulsifier. So you're binding two things which don't want to stick together.
Yeah.
And it's often used in cooking, and there are lots of really good emulsifiers. So like, mustard's one, egg's another. Arguably sunflower lecithin and soy lecithin. I'm saying arguably because there'll be some people who are going to scream and shout at this, but they're okay. There are lots of other emulsifiers, though, which are used in ultra-processed food, because basically the way that ultra-processed food works is you take the cheapest possible ingredients, you do all sorts of wonderful bits of chemical manipulation. So you sort of break them all apart, and then you need to glue them back together again. And that's when you use emulsifiers. And there is now more and more evidence that some of these emulsifiers which are being used are really not very good for your gut. So I think you're going to have Tim Spector on, who's a great gut expert, fairly soon. He'll talk to you more about it. But fundamentally, there are lots of man-made emulsifiers now, technical emulsifiers, which are really not very good for you.
Wow.
Which will just strip your gut out. And it's sort of like taking, a course of antibiotics in terms of the damage it does to your gut microbiome. So you really want to be careful. And, mass-produced chocolate uses a lot of emulsifiers. And it uses it for weird reasons, which is actually the first patent for, I think, soy lecithin in the UK was for chocolate, because it stops the machines gumming up. And then people also discovered that it actually helps in robing the chocolate too. But in general, outside of sunflower lecithin, be a bit skeptical about emulsifiers in chocolate. They're not a good thing. And there are lots of chocolate makers who even sort of, don't want that sort of emulsifiers in it. But let's go back to the dark secret. Because the amazing thing about chocolate is that it really wasn't very big on the scene until the Swiss figured out how to make chocolate bars which were smooth, Lindt, and then chocolate bars which had milk in them, so they're, even more delicious and lovely. Back in the turn of the century. And that's really when chocolate sort of took off. Before then, it was a very small crop. I mean, we all sort of like to pretend that we were up there with tea and up there with coffee, but we weren't really. I mean, it was, it wasn't massively consumed in Europe until the late 19th century. But then what happened is that once people realized how brilliant it is as a vector for other flavors, that's when it really started to move. But the problem is that at the same time, chocolate is very prone to disease, and it's also backbreaking to grow. So chocolate sort of hits Europe late 19th century. A lot of it is actually coming from a small island off the coast of West Africa called São Tomé, which is a principality of Portugal. And they couldn't get anybody to work easily in São Tomé. So even though everybody's abolished slavery, they're basically using indentured labor. And what happens to...
What does indentured labor mean?
Slavery. It's a fancy way of basically saying
Sounds
slavery.
fancy, indentured.
It's basically a weasel word for saying that you basically got people using slave labor. And so late 19th century, a lot of the chocolate being consumed in Europe by, all these very ethical companies like Cadbury's, is coming from these slave labor plantations in São Tomé. There's some amazing journalists, and even more amazingly, the suffragettes and the suffragists, so the people who give women the vote, get behind this and organize a boycott. And this is when chocolate moves to West Africa, but the supply chains, lo and behold, become incredibly complicated and convoluted. So most of the times when you buy a bar of chocolate, even the maker doesn't really know where the beans are coming from. So you don't really know what labor conditions are like when it comes from. And there's still huge problems in the chocolate supply chain with labor. So back in the 1990s, the BBC did some amazing work where they showed that, lots of the chocolate in West Africa was unfortunately being grown by kids who'd been sold into slavery. And the reason for this is that, the World Bank, the UN, everybody else believes that you need, for a family to live on, a man and a woman need to be earning $2.50 to $3 a day to basically be able to live. The problem is the average cocoa farmer in West Africa gets paid less than 80 cents a day if they're male and less than 30 cents a day if they're female. So there's no way they can afford to send their kids to school. And if it gets even more desperate, there were cases of them selling their children basically to try and help them, or basically because that was the only way they could live. And you had these terrible examples of child slave labor. And it still goes on. There is still lots of, kids working in conditions which you would not find acceptable. And it's because we don't pay enough for the chocolate. And what happens with chocolate as we go through the 20th century is, even though demand for it just keeps going up, because there's a very small number of people who buy it. So like 80-90% of the world's chocolate, 70% of the world's chocolate comes from two countries, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. Of that, 80-90% of it's bought by less than a dozen companies. And they can set the price for it. It's very difficult to sort of distinguish between different chocolates because it's just a commodity. And so even though the demand's going up, the price that people are paying for it is going down and down and down. And so they don't get paid enough, so they basically can't send their kids to school. And it gets even more dangerous than this because the other side which happens to chocolate is that the way to grow more chocolate, if it's your main cash crop, is you cut down the rainforest and you plant clones of cacao. So if you go back and you look at, pictures of, or if you look at rainforest canopy cover for Ghana and the Cote d'Ivoire, which is where most chocolate comes from, it used to be 60% plus virgin rainforest. By 1990, it's below 30%. And now it's 2 or 3% at worst, at best.
And this is cut down due to chocolate production.
Chocolate's definitely one of the big reasons why it's been cut down. Because basically, if you want to basically grow more of it, and also if you want to sort of put a bit of nitrogen back in the soil, you can do it by just burning down the forest.
Wow.
And so you have these extraordinary situations, and I'm going to get the exact numbers wrong, but basically you've got deforestation on the one hand, and then you've got the other problem, which is you've really dramatically changed how the rainfall comes. So it used to be that you'd get, in West Africa, 80 to 90 inches of rain a year, but it would be spread pretty evenly. Whereas now you only get 60 to 70, but you get it really concentrated, like a couple of weeks through the year.
Mm.
And this all then has one more big problem, which is that, we all get very worried about the amount of sort of water used to grow almonds or to grow even avocados. But neither of them are anything like as water hungry as cacao because it's a rainforest crop. And to grow effectively one bar of chocolate requires about 1.5 to 2,000 liters of water.
1.5 to 2,000?
Yeah. So to put this in context, an avocado is about 300. And I think like 50 grams worth of almonds is about 500 to 700.
You're talking 4 times.
Yeah, it's huge. But just to put, what 1,500 liters of water is, a bathtub's about 70 liters of water. So it's a lot. So if you want to save the rainforest, if you want to basically stop deforestation, if you want to stop child slave labor, have craft chocolate. So check where the beans come from, check what the ingredients are, check where it's been made, because you then know.
It will cost you more, but it's going to leave you more to savor it. That sometimes you're worth paying that bit extra because you actually appreciate it. And I think that's the subtle thing.
You'll eat less, but savor more.
So how do, and this is the issue. Like, I go to the supermarket and there's Lindt and there's Cadbury's and there's, they're the bars which people recognise in Ireland and the UK and probably in lots of Europe. They're the same type of chocolate bars, and it's confection really rather than chocolate bars.
It's taste rather than flavour.
It tastes rather than flavour because it's fat and it's salt and it's got a little bit of sugar in it. It really is a great combination. The Bliss Point, particularly the milk chocolates. And where do you get craft chocolate? Like, where does one get it?
It's really hard to get craft chocolate. So that's why we set up Cocoa Runners